For millions of American kids, walking through those doors felt like stepping into another world. Towering shelves of toys stretched further than you could see. A giraffe mascot waved from every corner, and there was a jingle that somehow still lives in the heads of people now, in their 30s and 40s. Toys R Us wasn't just a store. For a couple of generations, it was practically a rite of passage. At its peak, it was the largest toy retailer on the planet, with well over 1,500 stores and a level of cultural presence most companies could only dream of. So when the company shut down almost 750 stores and liquidated in 2018, plenty of people assumed the obvious explanation. Amazon killed another retailer, case closed. But that explanation, while convenient, misses most of the real story. Toys R Us wasn't simply outcompeted, it was financially engineered into a position where survival became almost impossible, years before the worst of it ever reached headlines. This is the story of how a beloved American brand was quietly set up to fail by the very deal that was supposed to save it. The company's roots go back to 1948, when a man named Charles Lazarus opened a small baby furniture store in Washington, D.C. He noticed customers kept asking him for toys too, so he leaned into that demand, eventually rebranding the business entirely around toys and children's products. By the 1950s and 60s, he had built something new for American retail, a store dedicated entirely to toys, at a scale nobody had really attempted before. The formula worked. Huge selection, low prices, and a supermarket-style layout that let kids wander and browse instead of just pointing at a locked display case. Through the 1980s and 90s, the company expanded aggressively, both across the US and internationally, becoming one of the defining retail brands of the era. But by the early 2000s, cracks were already forming. Big box retailers like Walmart and Target had figured out that toys were a great way to bring families through the door, and they could afford to sell them at razor-thin margins because toys weren't their main business. Toys R Us didn't have that luxury. Toys were essentially all it sold. That single fact would matter more than almost anyone realized at the time. By 2004, sales were sluggish, the stock price was underperforming, and the company looked like an aging brand searching for direction. That's when a group of investors saw an opportunity, and this is where the real story begins. In 2005, a consortium made up of Bain Capital KKR and the real estate firm Vornado bought Toys R Us in what's known as a leveraged buyout for a total of about $6.6 billion. Here's the part that matters most, and it's worth slowing down to actually understand it because it explains almost everything that happened afterward. In a leveraged buyout, the buyers don't just use their own money. They borrow heavily to fund the purchase, and then that debt gets loaded onto the company they just bought. So Toys R Us, a company that hadn't taken on that kind of debt before, was suddenly saddled with roughly $5 billion in new obligations. It didn't choose to take on that debt to grow, or to open new stores, or to modernize. It inherited it simply because it had just been purchased. Think about what that actually means for a business. Every single year, before Toys R Us could spend $1 on renovating stores, improving its website, training employees, or competing on price, it first had to pay several $100 million in interest, not toward paying down the debt itself, just the interest. Year after year. That's money that, in a healthier version of this company, could have gone toward exactly the kind of reinvention that might have kept it relevant. And this is where the Amazon narrative starts to look a lot less convincing. Yes, e-commerce was rising. Yes, Walmart and Target were becoming more aggressive with toy pricing, but plenty of retailers faced those same pressures and adapted. Toys R Us was structurally prevented from adapting at the pace it needed to because so much of its cash was already spoken for before it ever hit the register. There's a particularly telling piece of this story involving Amazon directly, and it shows just how much this deal shaped every decision that followed. Years before the buyout, Toys R Us had actually struck a partnership with Amazon, agreeing to be their exclusive toy seller online in exchange for a placement deal. On paper, it looked like a smart way to get into e-commerce without building the infrastructure themselves. But the arrangement eventually fell apart in a lawsuit, and Toys R Us won a settlement, but the damage was already done. They'd spent years without meaningfully investing in their own online presence, trusting a partner that had every incentive to eventually build out its own competing toy business. By the time Toys R Us tried to catch up digitally, it was doing so while carrying an enormous debt load, competing against a company with essentially unlimited resources for reinvestment. Now here's a question worth asking. If the debt was the real problem, why didn't the company just find a way to pay it down or refinance? The honest answer is that it tried repeatedly, but every plan required capital the company simply didn't have freed up. Store remodels that competitors were doing routinely became major financial decisions instead of standard maintenance. A crumbling shopping experience became harder to fix, which pushed more customers toward stores that felt newer and more convenient. It became a slow, grinding cycle. Less reinvestment led to a weaker customer experience, which led to declining sales, which made the existing debt even harder to manage. By the mid-2010s, the company was paying somewhere around $400 million a year in interest alone. To put that in perspective, that's money that in a single year likely exceeded what many retailers spend on store renovations across their entire chain. The private equity firms that orchestrated the deal, meanwhile, had already extracted management fees and other payments over the years, regardless of how the underlying retail business was actually performing. This is one of the most criticized aspects of leverage buyouts in general. The financial engineers can often benefit from a deal even if the operating company eventually collapses under the weight of it. In September of 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, listing roughly $5 billion in debt, almost exactly what had been loaded onto the company more than a decade earlier. Initially, the plan was reorganization, not liquidation. Executives spoke about using the process to shed debt and modernize the business. But that holiday season, the most important sales period of the year for any toy retailer, vendors grew nervous. Shipments slowed, and consumer confidence in the brand's stability collapsed at exactly the wrong moment. By early 2018, the company announced it would be liquidating entirely in the United States, closing every remaining store and laying off around 30,000 employees. The public reaction was immediate and emotional in a way that's fairly rare for a retail bankruptcy. This wasn't treated like just another struggling chain closing its doors. People shared childhood photos. News segments covered the closing sales with a tone usually reserved for something closer to a funeral. Former employees spoke about losing severance and benefits they'd been promised. And a significant part of that public anger was directed not at the company's day-to-day leadership, but at the private equity structure that had, in the eyes of many, set the business up to fail from the very beginning. There's an interesting postscript here too. The Toys R Us brand didn't disappear entirely. In the years since liquidation, a different company acquired the intellectual property and has slowly been reintroducing the name, first through smaller store-within-a-store partnerships, and later through new flagship locations. It's a fascinating example of how a brand's emotional value can outlive the business that originally built it, even after the operating company itself was gone. So what's the actual lesson here? It's tempting to treat every retail collapse as a simple story about the internet killing brick-and-mortar shopping. Sometimes that's accurate, but Toys R Us is a reminder that the way a company is financed can matter just as much as how well it's run day to day. A business can have a beloved brand, a loyal customer base, and genuine cultural relevance, and still be pushed toward collapse by decisions made in a boardroom that had nothing to do with toys at all. It's a pattern worth understanding because leveraged buyouts like this one aren't unique to Toys R Us. Similar structures have played out across other well-known American retailers and probably will again. This video is for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice.